the United States and the Soviet Union on a sheet of ice in Lake Placid, New York.
Muller trying to turn. There's the left foot. What a cracking shot. Gerdie Muller.
If you see a 9-9, Olga Korbut's won a gold medal. There it is.
5 seconds left in the game. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Unbelievable.
You're listening to a podcast from Key Moments in Cold War Sports History, an online archive series showcasing the work of expert historians. I'm Vince Hunt and I'll be hosting the series, asking each guest to choose an important document or artefact they think is of great significance in the Cold War sports arena. Incidentally, if you like these shows, please share them with your friends and colleagues and rate and review us on iTunes. It really helps new listeners find us. The rivalry between the two great powerhouses of ice hockey, Canada and the Soviet Union, is a fascinating story and one that comes to an amazing climax as the result of the period of détente in the Cold War, in 1972 to be exact, in a series of matches known as the Summit Series. In this podcast, you'll hear two experts on the drama of this series and also the political moves behind the scenes to make it happen. The first speaker is Professor David MacDonald of the History Department of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who was an eyewitness to the incredible events on the ice. The second voice is Jim Hirschberg, professor at George Washington University and the first director of the Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Before World War II, Canada was the dominant power in ice hockey. So how did the Soviet Union become so strong? Here's David MacDonald.
After World War II, as part of a general engagement of participation in international sport, which they traditionally shunned, the Soviet authorities look at ice hockey too as a sport at which they think they can succeed. There's a legendary trainer or coach named Anatoly Tarasov who looks at the Canadian game. The Soviets, like a lot of Northern Europeans, had played a game that we call bandy in English, or hockey with a ball in Russian. And they decide, no, in order to participate internationally, they had to master ice hockey. So they found a lot of former footballers, and indeed one of the earliest stars of Soviet ice hockey was a guy named Vsevolod Bobrov, who was an excellent striker for a couple of Moscow sides, but also a brilliant skater and excelled in both sports. They found a lot of footballers, and Tarasov described what he was doing in a book he wrote called The Road to Olympus. And it was take the Canadian system, but to make it more refined, to make it strategically more sophisticated, because of the lack of body contact in the international game, to stress absolutely fundamentals like passing combinations, skating, and the like. He did like a lot of, he wanted to introduce a scientific element into the game. And like a lot of Soviet athletics personnel, but Soviet artists and the like as well, this pride in bringing scientific method was to them a distinctive attribute of their system, as was, at least according to Tarasov's emphasis, the primacy of the collective endeavor over individual brilliance, although that was always a struggle, even when we thought the Soviet sides were these automatons. So anyway, by the mid-50s, Tarasov's efforts are beginning to bear fruit. And Canadian sides, professional sides in the National Hockey League, were banned from participating in International Ice Hockey Federation sanctioned events because they were professionals, and this was an amateur pursuit. So Canada had sent just I think it was usually the Allen Cup winner, the winner of the senior so-called ice hockey championship for amateurs. And beginning in the 1950s, started to encounter resistance. They lost a couple of times, and that got Canadians' attention. Up until that point, Canadians hadn't paid attention. But by the early 1960s, Soviet dominance in international amateur quote-unquote ice hockey is becoming unquestioned. The U.S. wins a gold medal in 1960, and then after that, Soviet dominance. And Canadian frustrations start to mount. They try to put together teams of amateurs, but the only amateurs you can put out are students, university students, and in the Canadian system, not even on scholarship. They're doing it strictly and literally as amateurs for the love of the game. So Canada decides, we're not going to participate in this farce anymore. By that time, interest is growing on both sides in putting together some sort of exhibition, series of friendlies, in which that would pit Canadian professionals against the Soviets. And there were several levels of reasoning here. Canadian Hockey Pride, Canadian organized hockey, they wanted to showcase once and for all the indomitable superiority of the Canadian game. The Soviets felt, no, they thought they had a serious chance. This was something they debated quite intensely among themselves, and they thought they had a chance. But at the same time, it was the beginning of what we start to call détente after the invasion, the Czech invasion of '68. Different political leaders, including then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, are looking for ways to reach out and build bridges with the other side. And Trudeau's motivated as well by at that point there's a huge national discussion on what does it mean to be a Canadian? What is Canadian identity? And much against his own instincts and preferences, hockey is something that emerges. Ice hockey is something that emerges as this. But he also wanted to establish a certain amount of autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. This was a period when Canada is distancing itself from the involvement in Vietnam. Trudeau reaches out to the People's Republic of China, and it's at this time that formal relations are established. And this overture to the Soviets also played into that. The Soviets welcomed the overture. And by the spring of '72, we see the chance for a showdown, except nobody thinks it's going to be that. Going into the late August '72, the Canadians, and I was 17 at that point, in a city called Saskatoon in Western Canada, the province of Saskatchewan. I wasn't even much of an ice hockey fan at that point, but I just knew, it'll be good. Just finally put paid to all this Soviet amateur superiority nonsense. And we were all wondering, well, is it going to go? There were 8 games scheduled, 4 in Canada, Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, Vancouver, and 4 in the Soviet Union.
Canada prides itself as the palace of ice hockey, and the Canadians really felt that it was virtually a birthright that they would dominate the sport. But in the 20th century, as the Soviet Union moved along and aspired to global leadership, especially under Stalin, hockey became quite popular in the Soviet Union. And during Stalin's period and afterwards, in the 50s, the Soviets began to emulate what was widely called Canadian hockey, using a puck. And in the 50s, the Soviets began to compete internationally and joined the Olympic movement. And the Soviets got very good at it. And in the late 50s and into the 1960s, they began to win almost regularly, not only Olympic gold medals in hockey, but also the annual International Ice Hockey Championships. And this became sort of a bone in the Canadians' throat because the issue of amateurs versus professionals came to be very important in international ice hockey. Under Olympic rules, only amateurs were allowed to play, and this clearly excluded the paid professionals of the National Hockey League, which of course included the best Canadian ice hockey players. However, under the technicalities of the Olympic regulations, the Soviets and the Czechs, for example, who were also very avid ice hockey players, were considered amateurs even though they received extensive state support. And for a while this was fine with the Canadians because even their sort of third-rate club teams that were not professionals were able to successfully compete. But as the Soviets got better and better and began to dominate, the Canadians began to get more upset and complained loudly at what they considered these unfair rules. And by the late 1960s, the Canadians in protest even dropped out of international ice hockey competition, sort of leaving the field to the Soviets. They won 9 consecutive international ice hockey championships at one point, but the Soviets were actually getting kind of bored, and their coach, Tarasov, began to complain that we want our best to play the Canadians' best. And this was seen not only as a clash of great hockey players, if it could happen, but a clash of obviously the two titans of the Cold War, the East and the West, but also different styles. The Soviets were seen as playing a more collective style, emphasizing teamwork, passing, what were seen as socialist values to emulate, whereas the Soviets depicted the Canadians as more thuggish, individualistic, goonish capitalists. And so this was more and more frustrating to hockey fans around the world, and to Canadians and to Soviets, that you could not supersede this dispute over amateurs versus professionals and have a best versus best clash. Now, everyone knows, and of course every Canadian knows, that finally this clash did happen. The so-called Summit Series of 1972 took place, and this was an epic event. It involved 4 games in Canada, followed by 4 games in the Soviet Union. To the shock of Canadians, the Soviets defeated the Canadians when they had their first match in the famed Montreal Forum, and took a 3-1 lead with one time. And yet the Canadians came back and won the last 3 games and won the final game with 34 seconds left, a goal by Paul Henderson. Every Canadian remembers that moment as the greatest moment in Canadian history.
I was a first-year student at the University of Saskatchewan at that point, and we had a chemistry lab session. I was taking first-year chemistry, and go in, and the labs were 4 hours, and we're all so dutiful that it's going to overlap the match time, but we go in, and the teaching assistants, the lab techs, look at us, and they say, if you think we're doing chemistry today, you've got another thing coming. Get the hell out of here. They said in much stronger language. And so everybody just dispersed. And some people went to the pub. I went back to my parents' house. I was too nervous to watch it in company, right? And but everybody knows where they were watching that game. Like, the papers were just flooded with commentary about what this was going to mean. And funnily enough, the guy in the Montreal newspaper kept a low profile. John Robertson didn't say a lot. Didn't say "I told you so" yet, although he had the week before. The game is it's furious, end-to-end action, very intense. People are playing hockey too. There's very little in the way of dirty play. They're really playing hockey, and it's for keeps. And it's tie game, and with 34 seconds to go, Paul Henderson breaks through. He gets a pass from out of the corner, and he bangs on it once, doesn't go in, bangs on it again, and it goes in. And the call, there was a legendary sportscaster, sort of like Kenneth Wolstenholme of Canadian sport, a guy named Foster Hewitt, who says, Henderson scores for Canada. And you know, the news that night, they just show classrooms exploding. I know that in my neighborhood, a residential neighborhood, detached dwellings, you could hear cheers going up and down the street. There was no traffic on the streets. And then everybody just, the streets filled. I ran to campus. My parents lived about 20 minutes away. Ran to campus. It was just thronged. And the rest of the day, bars filled. That night they replayed the game, and we all watched it in a bar downtown, and it was just as intense and exciting then as it had been that afternoon. But this incredible moment of expiation and relief. And our boys came back from behind. They showed that grit and independent spirit and individualism and effort can overcome collectivism and the robotic, unemotional, et cetera, et cetera. It became a really bipolar story, binarized story about ideology and systems. And ironically, it was not only had we come out by the skin of our teeth, but looking back on it, it was a way we were playing a meaningful role in the Cold War. You got to remember, this is a country that, by its own lights and by most lights, well, at the end of the Second World War, was probably the 6th or 7th most heavily armed country in the world, had demilitarized quickly, had sort of settled back into being a second-tier power in this conflict that was meaningful to a lot of Canadians because, say in my part, Western Canada, a lot of my compatriots trace their ancestry to Ukraine or to Mennonites, Anabaptist farmers who had settled in southern Russia, or to parts of the Baltic, or that the Russian fact was a real fact, but we had always been sort of on the sidelines, and it was a way that it really established in our own minds what we were and who we were. And it gave us a reputation in Russia as something very different from the Americans. And for all that series was very fraught, that maple leaf became something really symbolically important to Russians of my generation, that I went to study in Leningrad 3 years later, and I'd wear a maple leaf pin, and it meant a lot. It meant you weren't American, it meant something different. There had been very pleasant memories of them. And it says something about Canadian history where people's defining moments, like if you're in my generation, you're American, where were you when Kennedy was shot?
The key event that led to the agreement to hurdle the deadlock that had blocked this competition from taking place for years took place a year earlier when Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin visited Canada in October 1971. And this visit followed a visit to the Soviet Union by Canada's Premier Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And Trudeau's visit is actually widely remembered because he brought along his new young wife, Maggie, and he cut a very dashing figure, and this was a very successful visit. But much to the surprise of Canadian diplomats, Kosygin accepted with alacrity a protocol invitation to pay a reciprocal visit to Canada. And when he came to Canada, Canadian documents show that hockey played a very interesting role in his visit. It's mostly remembered for what happened publicly, which is that Kosygin was dogged by protesters throughout his trip in Ottawa, in Montreal, in Toronto. Protesters followed him everywhere, and even a protester, Hungarian emigre, still furious at the Soviets for invading his country in 1956, actually tackled Kosygin at one point, jumped on his back. He had to be pulled off by Trudeau and police on Canada's Parliament Hill. And actually the photographs appeared on the front page of every paper in the country. But what turned out to be the highlight of Kosygin's visit and his favorite moment was when he attended an NHL hockey game in Vancouver between the Vancouver Canucks and the Montreal Canadiens. And I discovered in the Canadian archives that this event had been debated privately for weeks before the trip. Kosygin's representatives thought he might be too tired. It was on the same evening after he had flown across Canada from Montreal to Vancouver. He was exhausted. I discovered in the archives that actually in the hotel in Vancouver, he said he did not want to go to the game, both because he was exhausted and also because he feared that protests would disrupt the game. The Canadians who Trudeau had designated to accompany him begged with him, said everything was arranged. They pleaded with him. He finally agreed to go. And much to his shock, he received an extremely warm welcome, a standing ovation from the Vancouver crowd. He had a fascinating meeting before the game with the captains of the Vancouver and Montreal hockey clubs. In fact, there's a great moment I discovered from Vancouver newspapers. Everyone remembers the kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Nikita Khrushchev in 1959. There was a locker room debate in Vancouver between Alexei Kosygin and Henri Richard, the captain of the Montreal Canadiens, who was known as the Pocket Rocket because he was the younger brother of the famous Maurice Richard, the Rocket, the most famous goal scorer in NHL history until that time. And they debated whose hockey was better, Soviet or Canadian. And Kosygin said Soviet hockey was, and Richard said, well, maybe you'll beat us at first, but when we get used to you, we can beat you. And it was very interesting, a very friendly debate. Richard presented Kosygin with a stick, and there were photographs of Kosygin testing the stick. He also received a pair of CCM skates and talked about his enthusiasm. But what's most interesting is that when he watched the hockey game, which the Canadians won 6-0, the Canadians were perennial Stanley Cup contenders. The Vancouver Canucks were an upstart new expansion team just in their second season. They got creamed. Kosygin sat with the Vancouver general manager, and they discussed and as Kosygin put it, what a shame it was that our best hockey players can't play against each other. And he admitted that he couldn't even really explain or defend the distinction between amateurs and professionals that had prevented those teams from playing. And he promised to look into the problem and see what he could do. And it so happened that Kosygin's visit also coincided with something very important that I discovered, which is that just before his visit, the Soviet coach had published an article in Sovietsky Sport, the leading Soviet sports journal. This is Tarasov, challenging the NHL to play. What are you afraid of, he said. Your best against our best. And this was something that even might have gone a little bit out of channels, because most Soviet sports and hockey authorities, or apparatchiks, were loath to play the Canadians, yet because the Olympic Committee chair, Avery Brundage, had warned that not only could professionals not compete in the Olympics, but that any players who played against the Canadian professionals would be tainted, and they would not be allowed to participate. And the Olympics were coming up in Sapporo, Japan, in February 1972, and the Soviets wanted to do nothing that might endanger winning another gold medal in Sapporo, which in fact they did. But Tarasov was so eager, he said, we want to play the Canadians, one way or another. When Kosygin returned to Moscow after his trip to Canada, which he told Canadians that the hockey game was the highlight of, even though he had been ambivalent about attending until the very last moment, I discovered, he didn't just sit back. He clearly acted, because a few weeks later, the Soviet embassy in Ottawa secretly approached the Canadian government and said, hey, one of our best teams will be in North America in December. How about it plays several games against Canadian professional teams of the NHL in January 72? And this would have even been before the Olympics in Sapporo the next month. So theoretically, it could have endangered those players' right and eligibility to compete in the Olympics. The Canadians thought that was impractical because it was in the middle of the NHL season. It would be too complex. But they gave a counter-proposal. Let's have a best versus best series before the beginning of the 1972 NHL season, meaning in September 72, which is exactly what took place. And in the end, the final agreement to hold that series was not reached until the spring of 72, actually in Prague at the annual World Championship ice hockey tournament, which the Canadians boycotted, but sent some representatives to meet with Soviet representatives. And most of the historiography, most of the existing accounts, in fact, all of the existing accounts that have been published in Canada, and there are many books about the 72 series, only talk about the agreement to stage the series being reached in the spring of 1972. But my research has shown is that it was really the fall of 71 and Kosygin's trip, which was also tied in with fascinating Cold War currents, the triangular diplomacy between the United States and China and the Soviet Union, détente with the United States. There were multiple motives at play when Kosygin visited Canada, but hockey entered into the calculations, and the wider context influenced the hockey because it was clearly a way both to enhance Soviet relations with the West in a cultural soft power way that coincided with the détente of that period. In fact, the highlight of détente took place in May 72 when Richard Nixon visited Moscow and signed a series of arms control treaties. But it was also a way for the Soviets to try to sort of cultivate the Canadians. Trudeau had famously expressed some resentment about American domination of Canadian life when he visited the Soviet Union in May 1971. And this was a way for the Soviets to sort of like try to upstage the Chinese initiative of Richard Nixon and say, hey, we can play with your neighbor and have good relations even while you're playing with our neighbor in the communist world. And so while sports historians have understandably focused on the drama that took place on the ice during the games of the Summit Series, I found that there was also quite a fascinating backstory to how the Summit Series took place in the first place and how it really broke the ice and enabled regular competitions to take place for the rest of the Cold War and the rest of the existence of the Soviet Union for the next 2 decades between the best Soviet ice hockey players and other Soviet bloc ice hockey players, especially the Czechs, and the best Canadian and NHL, and for that matter, other leagues, professional players, and really revolutionized the way the two sides related on the ice during the Cold War.
The big argument during the 70s and the 80s and first part of the 90s was who was better, Canada or the Soviet Union, and that was the rivalry. I don't think it's a strong rivalry now. Now it tends to be more Canada, the United States. Russia's trying to come back together, but that was a product, in a sense, the ideological critique was right that these players were full-time professionals. They spent more time with the game than certainly their professional counterparts in North America did. but they were also in a system, right? Very strong, powered by one coach. The loss against Canada in 1972 started introducing fault lines in play. What we didn't understand was these players themselves had personalities, agendas. There'd been a lot of controversy in putting together the Soviet team. A couple of the best players were left off because of the personal dislike of the coach. The person who was supposed to coach wasn't allowed to coach for all sorts of reasons of politics and temperament. We never understood that. We were seeing it through a Cold War lens. You start to see more and more of that appear in Soviet hockey over the ensuing 2 decades. And now it's probably an obstacle to them being a really potent force in international ice hockey. They're always there, but I don't know, once they've tasted the flesh pots of Philadelphia or whatever, they're not as easy. They're not as amenable to a certain approach to coaching as their forebears were.
You've been listening to a podcast from the series Key Moments in Cold War Sports History, a project bringing together experts from around the world and hosted here on the Wilson Centre's online digital archive at digitalarchive.org. These podcasts are part of the project The Global History of Sport in the Cold War, which is sponsored by the National Endowment of the Humanities, directed by Professor Bob Edelman of UC San Diego, Professor Chris Young from the University of Cambridge, and Dr. Christian Ostermann of the Woodrow Wilson Centre, and run in collaboration with the German Historical Institute Moscow, the Jordan Centre for Advanced Russian Studies at New York University, and Pembroke College, University of Cambridge. The presenter is Vince Hunt, and the series is produced by Vince Hunt and Laura Deal.